So who's got a burning question, and can it be a question, please? Oh, Mark, yes. Go ahead.
50-50.
Elizabeth, when we talked on the phone when you were coming here, you spoke about to me that you had talked with quite a few scholars, Orthodox scholars in American universities, and were surprised by some of their reactions to what you were finding or writing about Vladimir Pisano. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean that most of them don't want to consider a female author or any alternate author.
You mentioned one man who was absolutely fascinated, but said he couldn't look into it, that it would endanger his job, or it would be difficult for him to investigate it. Was that true?
Yes. I mean, there are a few scholars I spoke with who are very interested in the idea that women were writing in that period, and I mentioned Phyllis Racken at the University of Pennsylvania, who wrote an article a few years ago called "Anonymous Was a Woman," saying that we have to do away with this assumption that there were no female writers. There probably were, and they just weren't writing under their own name. And there are others who are intrigued by Amelia's role. One of these was at an English professor at Yale, who's quite a prominent Shakespeare scholar, and he thinks, his conclusion essentially was that it needs to be pursued, that she's a fascinating figure, and that it's possible. He was willing to believe that it's possible that she had a role in writing the plays, but he didn't want to be quoted saying that.
You had a feeling that was a bit risky for him in his professional capacity.
I think so, yes. I think, as everyone here knows, really, that anyone who questions the authorship is mocked as a lunatic or, a fantasist, and it's not taken seriously among scholars as a worthwhile avenue of research. It wasn't discussed at all at Princeton when I was studying Shakespeare. We studied the plays, but no one discussed it as a serious avenue of inquiry. So I had sort of heard, as you do, that some people didn't think it was Shakespeare, and it didn't seem to me. I wasn't too concerned with which white man it was who wrote the plays.
Right.
But once I read deeper into them, and I was very interested in the feminist aspects, the idea that it was a woman, that seemed to me to matter.
Robin, did you want to add into that?
I just wanted to say there are plenty of scholars in this room.
Yeah.
There are a number of scholars here.
Well, the sort of the English Shakespeare establishment, I suppose, of tenured English professors don't treat it as a serious question.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is mainly for the actors on the panel. I run an all-female Shakespeare company called the Sara Sisters. And I have always been quite strict, I suppose, on my approach to keeping the genders in the play as they are. And I was wondering, how do you go about that with the pronouns? What are your views on that? Do you prefer to keep the characters as male characters when you're playing a male character, or would you change it to she? So for instance, I've just seen 12th Night at Bristol Vic, and they had Lady Toby Belch. And I don't know what that added to it, and I was wondering what your views are on that.
I prefer to keep them as the genders that they're written as. It's easier and it's less confusing for everybody. I think it would be a really interesting exercise to try to do Shakespeare with gender-neutral pronouns, and I wonder if anybody's tried that yet. Because I played Prospero once, and the director wanted to make Prospero female, so I played Prospero female, and they think they changed the pronouns for that. And I don't know. It's just a personal preference. It just feels a bit odd to me. But it's an interesting question. I don't know what other people's preferences are, but I don't know whether anybody's ever tried to rewrite it to make it gender neutral, and now I'm getting ideas.
I think at some point you perhaps, if the audience feels they can, forget what the gender is, and it doesn't really matter.
I think they're more likely to forget if you leave it as it is.
Yeah, if you just leave it as it is, and you just go with it, and that's the story, and we're just people, human beings, skeletons.
Yeah.
And you just kind of forget after a while and don't listen to it. I don't know.
I've never
I've never been asked to play a male character, and I'm a bit torn actually about men playing female parts and women playing male parts. So I'm not quite sure that I'm sort of locked in something that's a little bit retarded, or I'm not quite sure. But I do think the more I watch Shakespeare and occasionally read it, I am conscious that whoever wrote these plays writes women in a very specific and remarkable way. And forgive me, I'm not particularly articulate about this or experienced in this field, actually, because I haven't been asked to play, cross-gender. But I do think that there is possibly a risk. It's exciting to explore investigating how women would play a man and man would play a woman. I do think that's interesting in principle. But actually, in terms of fulfilling the play, I do think that there might be a risk that as the women have been written so specifically, if you then have men, or sort of women playing men, that you emasculate then the women who have already been written as women. Do you see what I'm saying? That's my little worry.
Well, there's also, I played men all the way through school, at a girls' school, obviously. And so I had really no idea how to play my own gender when I left. But then 150 years later, when I finally got to Stratford, and I was playing Sir Andrew Aguecheek, which was a wonderful kind of full circle for me. But what I still find odd about that, there were 4 of us who were women playing men. Toby Belch, Fabian, and I were, Sir Andrew, were all by women, and Viola was played by a man. And we never, ever discussed what might be going on underneath this, what it might be for, what would be useful about it. We just had to sort of find our way through shark-infested waters, really, to get to the heart of what we had to say. And I would still love that director to come and actually spend an afternoon talking to us about what might be inside that particular box if we opened it up. So I think these things are very, very complex. Despite the fact I loved playing Sir Adrian, he's got a gorgeous part to play. You can't really lose playing him. I would still like to know, why was I having to put socks down my Y front?
Yes, at the back there.
Can I ask a question I just asked you again, Robin, which is basically somewhere, I can't remember where, in the historical record, there's a letter from the Countess of Pembroke to I can't remember who, which says we have the man Shakespeare here with us at Wilton House.
Yeah, in the late 1800s, there was a historian who went to Wilton House and spent some time there, and the current Countess of Pembroke said, oh, we have a letter that Mary Sidney wrote to her son, but it's been lost. And the letter said, told her son to come back and said, we have the man Shakespeare with us. Now the letter, she thought it was in the BL, she said, or the RO? PRO? The RO.
Records office.
Records office. Or the BL. I think it was the BL. And no one's ever found that letter.
There was a fire at Wilton House, there wasn't there, in the late 80s, early 90s?
Yeah, the docent that we had, I hired a docent for 3 days at Wilton House. And she believes that William Herbert exacerbated the fire at Wilton for his own personal purposes. That actually not that much of the house actually burned. But this letter, who knows, if you know how those bottoms of those museums and the libraries are, there are millions of things in there. But if the letter was to surface, then she is the only person who mentions meeting the man named William Shakespeare. And it might be true, it was still the younger son, not the older son. I see records that say she was writing to her older son. It wasn't. Her younger son was with James down the road a bit, and James did come, and they did do a play that is believed to be As You Like It. at Wilton House. So it looks like it probably was a real letter, but we don't actually have the piece of paper.
I'm not myself entirely convinced that it was a real letter, because I think it's one of those things that has conveniently disappeared. You know, everyone likes to have a connection to Shakespeare. You go to several pubs in London and they say Shakespeare drank here. Of course he did. We don't actually have any evidence that he did, but, you know, my grandfather's grandfather told me that he did, and it's just been passed down, and it's just one of those things sort of... Everyone wants that association. I just always say, give me the evidence, where's the document? Oh, it's disappeared. That's really unfortunate, because some people might want to believe in it and other people might not, but actually unless we have the document we can't inspect it. We can't. There have been so many famous forgeries in Shakespeare's documentary record. There were so many in the 19th century that were forged, that unless you can see it, analyse the paper, analyse the ink, you know, you can't tell. Yes.
What we do have is published dedications from both Marlowe and Nash to the Countess. They call her the muse of the poets of our time, whose virtue will live in eternity, or the second Minerva, the goddess of wisdom with her spear. Those are published works. Since New Oxford has shown that those are co-authors that worked with Pembroke's men in the early period, then that shows that Marlowe and Nash had the Countess as someone they saw as a leader when they were having their plays performed by Pembroke's men.
I would say
documented.
that I know absolutely there are documented dedications, and you're right about that. But as for the New Oxford Shakespeare proving co-authorship, there are some serious issues with stylometry, which are being unravelled by myself and some other scholars as we speak, things being published, etc. So,
with regards to scholars, I've had the same problem in the University of Toronto. The Elizabethans won't look at you because they have funding that depends on loyal Shakespeare donors. They will talk, however, about the co-author period. They will talk about the touring groups because we have the website for Read. And all of those things are an opportunity for us skeptics to talk scholarly issues with scholars without offending their strange sensibilities.
Yeah, co-authorship is the acceptable face of the authorship debate, and it does give us all an opportunity, as you say. Yeah.
On the issue of scholarship, it's always seemed to me to be there's always seemed to me to be a battle taking place between English scholarship and history scholarship. I speak as a history teacher who, in schools, has often found drama to be the purview of the English department rather than the history department. And it seems to me that a lot of the debate here is between an English establishment sort of an English and literature establishment that has an interest in sustaining Shakespeare and sustaining arguments about Shakespeare, and potentially a history establishment that would have more interest in evidence-based answers. So it seems that there's a natural ally to the authorship debate in history, perhaps more so than in English. So my question was going to be, to what extent have you used history, historians, history departments in universities as a source of support for the various theories that you bring together?
There's an interesting... I would love historians to come on board with this, and some have. I mean, Bill Rubenstein has. But recently there was an online criticism of me that I didn't have a history qualification. Of course, interestingly, none of the people who put forward the traditional argument have a history qualification either. So the point being, I have exactly the same qualification they do, which is a PhD in English literature. But I really think this is an area for historians to get involved in, and if professional historians got involved in it, it would be much harder for the English literature scholars to say, you know, this is madness, these are cranks. My first paper that was authorship question related when I was a PhD student was published in the journal Rethinking History, so in a history journal. The historians are far more receptive to the understanding that history is a story that's been made up. It's a narrative about the past. It isn't necessarily the past. Well, it isn't the past. It isn't necessarily factual. There are so many ways of creating history. So I'm all for working with historians. If you know any friendly historians, including yourself, who would like to co-author papers or author their own papers, just, let's talk, let's get in touch.
It is an interesting problem that historians don't pay much attention to it, and I think it gets to the issue of academic silos. This problem has fallen through the cracks because historians it's not part of their purview, it's not part of history departments. It is part of English departments, but they don't really have the qualifications to pursue it properly. And then even the silos between drama and English academia are very interesting to me because English scholars discount the intimate ways in which actors understand and experience the plays, which I think is incredible and so valuable, and that scholars just can, he's just a Shakespeare actor, he's not an actor, it's ridiculous. I mean, can you imagine understanding the plays better than from within, from acting them? So, it's an example of the ways in which the academia and the silos and the ways departments are divided allow some of the most interesting questions to just fall through the cracks.
Do you have something to say on this, Robin?
I've seen this in actors don't like the academics, and the academics think the actors don't quite know the depths of the play themselves. And I've seen how both scholars can dig so deep and actors can dig so deep, and I'm a little confused why there is that contention.
There's plenty of crossover there as well, and plenty of actors who have academic qualifications.
Yes,
I have an MFA in staging Shakespeare.
But in general, I would say generally, that's the feeling you get. I work with readers, so it's kind of an in-between thing. Readers who read out loud and talk about it. It took us a year to read Hamlet. It took us 2 hours to get to the first 13 lines of To Be or Not to Be. So what I really love is that intermediate area where I don't have to argue with actors about it or scholars. We just, a bunch of people just get together and read it slowly and carefully and talk about it. So, but I agree there are those silos that go both ways many times. And it's wonderful to hear when it's not.
I do think also that there is a common faint contempt that you're talking about, that actors don't really know what they're talking about. And I find it's exactly the same as people feel about actresses. There's a faint contempt because we can't be as serious as actors. And one of the reasons that we're all here today is because women's voices, it's very easy for people just to say, oh yes, she's like, I suppose you have to do the casting couch, do you dear? Quite a lot of that when I was in my 20s, just because I'd chosen acting as a profession. Men don't get that. In the same way, I think there is no reason to assume that actors may not know in their way, and it may be exactly the same way. If you're academically inclined as well, you want to dig into the research. But we have to get over that contempt somehow. We have to say, no, sorry, I have a right to say what I have to say, and you can listen.
Bravo, Annabel.
Yes, sorry.
I have to say all this is due to Mark. It was entirely Mark's idea that we should be doing something about women, and I think that is the most wonderful thing that you have done for us. It's been a very exciting day.
Yeah, Robin?
When I talked about how the women have carried Shakespeare throughout history, throughout the past 400 years. And it actually turned out to be a problem because when it came time to put Shakespeare in a university to be studied, that was what stopped Shakespeare from going in. Because if women could do it, it didn't have the intellectual rigor necessary to be in university. And that began the process of making Shakespeare difficult. The new bibliographers who saw it as a scientific study, to study it scientifically to see when plays were written, etc. So I just found that interesting. On the Oxford University website for their literature history, until the 1970s, literature was considered a soft option that drew off the weaker candidates, meaning women.
That sort of corresponds with the period in history where women weren't playing Hamlet. There was a huge history of women playing Hamlet,
and then
from the point that there were female actors, and then it sort of stopped in the 20s through to the 70s, and then started to revive again. So that's
right.
interesting that
Yeah.
sort of coincides historically.
When I ran this theatre, I remember the marketing department coming in telling me that 60% of tickets for the theatre were bought by women.
See?
60% or more. But the assumption that followed that was because the women their husbands were working, the women were home and had time. Not that maybe the women love Shakespeare more than the men.
Yes.
So when Leah did Miranda, I was really interested in the way you did that, Leah. Starting with a very conventional type of Miranda and then turning it around 180 degrees to a much more feisty, assertive type of Miranda. And it made me think that, there's a reason today why we've got only women who are presenting things. It's because there's this massive bias towards men in terms of having power over making decisions about Shakespeare. So the vast majority of directors, producers, editors, publishers over the centuries have been male, and they've unconsciously or otherwise made decisions which are male-orientated decisions about the plays. Like, for instance, cutting the most assertive lines from Miranda, cutting Ophelia's speech. Ophelia doesn't get to say very much, but when she does, she says really important things, and quite often gets just left out completely or marginalised in some way. Also, like Gertrude's speech in Hamlet, which is kind of treated like it's like some sort of party piece rather than it's just as valuable and meaningful as anything that Hamlet says. So in lots of different ways, you can see how men have kind of made marginal and superficial the female characters, but also female roles in theatre and in academia. In terms of until very recently, there's been very few women who have been given roles to where they can talk and write and research Shakespeare. Surely we're talking about a kind of political issue here. Yes, it's not just about what individuals do. It's about the fact.
Was there a question?
Yeah, is there a question?
It's very, very big bias in favour of men and against women.
Is there a question?
Was there a question in there?
Yes, don't you think that a long way towards redressing that balance, which is really deep rooted in the institutions of Shakespeare that we're all part of and relate to in some ways.
Is this part of redressing
one event
it?
like this is great, but surely we need to push that forward and have more and more awareness of this and have more and more women performing Shakespeare.
Can we push
and being
this?
in positions of power and making the decisions.
Maybe I'll turn that into a question. How can we push this forward and give women more power in the way that Shakespeare is studied and represented, directed, acted?
Well,
Thanks, Ross. That's exactly what I was trying to say.
I'm trying to do that just by reporting this article and showing, that there are now these major female candidates, Mary Sidney and Amelia Bassano, and most people haven't even heard of Amelia Bassano. Maybe they've heard of Mary Sidney by way of Philip Sidney, but when I do talk to people about it, they're fascinated by this, and if I think if it did come into sort of some common understanding, knowledge that there are strong cases at least out there for female candidates, it could change the way students think about Shakespeare. How will it change the reading of the plays if one day it's commonly accepted that a woman maybe had a hand here?
Yeah, I think Robin's information about so many of the bits of information there, but about there's all the different examples of strong women defying their fathers and the rest of it, and as well as the historical thing of Shakespeare so appealing to women that women essentially kept Shakespeare alive. This is stuff that should be really out there, that people should know this and understand the importance of women in this, and who are so often not written about, underrepresented, taken out of history completely. So we need to tell more stories of women and speak more to the strength of, really, no one came up against, with this idea that Shakespeare was a misogynist. I tried arguing about it on Twitter, and then I thought, this is really not a place to do this. It's a real waste of my time. But, there was a social historian on there saying, oh, come on, this is well established. And I was thinking, well, that's wrong then, isn't it? And hopefully when these videos go up on YouTube, more people will get to see the sort of female perspective on Shakespeare. I think it's very hard for any of us as individuals. We can only do what we can do. We can try and get together and kind of multiply our effects by supporting
we are all doing
each other.
stuff.
But we
All
are
of us
all
in
doing
our own
stuff.
ways of doing
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah.
To further that cause.
Exactly. Yeah, we are. We're doing what we can within the society in which we're operating. Mark, yeah.
Sarah, you played Titania in Peter Brook's Midsummer Night's Dream, didn't you? Do you find the rehearsal room has changed since those days towards women? Did you find that you had to fight battles that are easier or not necessary now? Have things improved?
I can't really answer that clearly, I don't think, because I mean, it was Peter Brook who did that production. I doubled Titania and Hippolytus, and my struggle was my struggle. It was my struggle as a young actor who was just not terribly comfortable in my own skin as an actor, and so I'm not the best person to talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream, actually. But I do think that although Peter Brook can be quite authoritarian, he also does actually create a very open forum, and I think he was always welcoming of both the female and the male voice. So I don't, and I would imagine that's just grown and grown and grown and grown and opened and opened and opened. If you were to talk about some other directors, like maybe, I mean, I was fortunate when I did As You Like It with John Dexter. I got on extremely well with him. He was extremely supportive, but he wasn't always so nice to people, and he wasn't always nice to women. And there are countless directors, which we don't have to name them, who have not been generous or kind, or can be very patronising still, I think, to women. So I don't know whether it's an ethos that's changed. I don't know. So I'm not really answering your question. Sorry.
That's so interesting that I would like to ask Leah, because you're coming in a little bit later than the rest of us to this platform of theatre, whether what you found to compare with Sarah's, have people allowed you your voice in rehearsals?
Most certainly, I've definitely been encouraged to speak, to use my voice, to kind of form opinions and be confident when I say them, because my personal struggle is that I'm not confident speaking eloquently about what I think. So, and I found I've been just over 2 years acting professionally, which is like nothing. And in that time, I've been in 2 all-female companies, and both really incredible productions. I've worked in TV and film as well, a lot of very female-led productions. So for me, my norm is all-female, which is weird, but that is my norm. So when I go into a room where there's, an even mix, or, it's not female-led particularly in every department, that is me kind of going, oh, this is interesting. This is not, this is new.
Did you say you didn't feel that you were eloquent? Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah. I'm working on it.
Is that what you said?
I'm improving.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
You are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely are.
Thank you. But yeah, my norm is all female, which is really weird. Great.
Yes.
Just chipping in on that, I have a niece who's sometimes co-writing, sometimes directing herself, and she usually, quite often, co-authors with a boyfriend, or other boys, as she says. She's about 28, and she said, "I'm not going to do that on the next one. Men can always tell you what's wrong with the play, but they've got absolutely no suggestions as to how to put it right."
Interesting.
It's a bit of a generalisation. Sideline.
Okay. Question at the back there.
We've heard very powerful evidence from Elizabeth and Robin today for 2 candidates, female candidates. I just wonder, it's a bit of an unfair question really, how they begin to reconcile, or
Well,
where's it go from here?
that is my question as well. I'm not, sold that it has to be Amelia exclusively. I don't want to, pin my name on one candidate. I'm very interested in exploring the question. So I think, Mary Sidney is a fascinating candidate as well. And I'm interested in the possibility that, that they knew each other. Maybe they worked together. Maybe they were both working on the plays in some capacity.
Yeah.
Who knows? I think that what's clear is that there needs to be a lot more research, that it needs to be explored further.
It would be odd if Mary Sidney and Amelia did not know each other. But I'm always looking for documented evidence. So I don't like to make a leap that, surely they did. But
is it perhaps possible that they did, and that she said he did, or they worked together, or that she had knowledge about?
I mean, the only thing that I can think about that would be cooler than the author being one woman was if it was.
I want to see that. Just talking about that's the film I want to see. We've had Anonymous. Can we have that next? Can we have that?
I mean, Spear Partnership, that would have been.
Yeah, Spear Shakers. You got a title?
That's great.
Thank you. Aren't we possibly falling into the trap, because I've done the MOOC, so I know it's all about evidence, and if we're looking at Emilia and these other people, there's absolutely no evidence at all what they wrote the plays, is there? There's circumstantial and contextual, if that's the right word, I'm not academic.
It's more than Shakespeare has.
Yeah, I know, exactly. But there isn't any evidence that anybody wrote the plays. Obviously somebody did, but by setting them up, I think they're more likely as well. But
well, I think there's evidence
falling into a trap in a way.
I do think there's evidence that whoever wrote the plays knew Amelia Bassano or knew the Bassano family because of the recurrence of that name and of the connection to Venice. The approach that John Hudson has taken, the advocate for Amelia, is to his background is in sociology, so talking about drawing on different disciplines. He approaches the problem of the authorship as a question in the sociology of knowledge. So categorizing all the different knowledge areas that the author of the plays displays. Italian, the Jewish connection, seemingly some knowledge of Hebrew, court, all these different things. But the Jewish and the Italian stuff is obviously a big part of it, and Denmark, there's so much in there. But the idea, I think, is that we may not ever have a piece of definitive evidence, but the question is who can match all of those knowledge categories. And that's how, having the education, having the knowledge of Italian and the reason to travel to Italy and know those very particular northern Italian towns that the author seems to have known, to have a reason to be referencing Jewish texts and Hebrew sources, and so it's checking off all those boxes, I think, that gets you closer to something like, a really convincing argument for a candidate.
I think that would be useful. Several people have asked me about a follow-on MOOC, because that was just introduction to, and one that actually explores the cases of the candidates. And I think that would be one of the aspects of it, is to look at what knowledge is revealed in the play. That always, where can you get it? Can you get it from books, or is it kind of on the ground knowledge? How rare was this knowledge? Someone else asked me about the North manuscript today. Is there manuscript source that this person could have got hold of but that person couldn't? So that's a really interesting way to look at the evidence for different candidates. Yes?
Sorry, I want to voice a sort of concern, and it's with the women writers in the 16th century who aren't considered as candidates. And my concern is that other people will come along and focus on the people that you're talking about and forget about the vast number of other women who've yet to be discovered, in inverted commas. So all I'm making is a plea that they don't get forgotten, because the authorship question actually dominates and says we're going to look at women who possibly wrote the Shakespeare plays. So I just want to put in a...
I'd like to answer that. I don't think there's any problem with the proliferation of candidates. I think there are always people popping into my inbox saying, I found, I've proved that, is normally how they begin. I've proved that so-and-so wrote the works. And I think, once people get hold of the idea that a woman might have written it, there will be, someone will be looking at there will always be new people putting forward other candidates until we get a sort of, I suppose, a stronger framework for ruling people out
Sorry, my concern is the fact that you only look at women writers of the 16th century who are considered candidates, and you forget about the vast number of women who've yet to be discovered.
In their own right, not as
Oh, I
authorship
see
candidates.
what you mean. Okay, yes.
I feel like we're on a...
stuff which isn't Shakespeare. I just don't want it to be forgotten in the sort of clamour to try and say that Shakespeare might have been a woman writer.
No,
I'm just asking that you don't forget people who wrote valuable stuff. Women.
There are scholars who work in those areas of looking at forgotten women, if you like, of rediscovering women writers. I mean, I think Amelia Lanya, in her own right, completely aside from the authorship question, really requires more. There needs to be more research on her than there has been.
Well, there are scholars who just study Amelia and her Salve Deus volume of poetry, but they're another divide. They're not the Shakespeare scholars. So you can read up on people analyzing her poetry and her life, but they are not the same people who write about Shakespeare.
Yes.
I would like you to remember that it may be interesting to ask the question, would it be a collaboration between male and female? Because the plays are so collaborative, they're so masculine, feminine, they're so bringing out that.
Well, they're so human.
Exactly, and I think that
not necessarily gender.
rather than
Well, one thing I did try to touch on was the suggestion that Marlowe and Amelia probably knew each other, and there's so much evidence for Marlowe's influence in the early Shakespeare plays. What I was trying to get at there was the possibility that there was a collaboration between Marlowe and Amelia, or if he was a sort of mentor figure for her as a playwright. That's another area that I think needs to be pursued.
We need to add Marlowe into the play, don't we?
We can make the
So,
two.
they can make the two.
One of the most moving films I've ever seen on the world of the theatre was A Stage Beauty.
Oh,
where
I
it
love
is
that.
made clear that all the actors were actors male. So the authors of the plays that we're talking about, whether male or female, all knew that the plays would only be performed by men. That was the norm at the time. Does it appear anywhere in the plays that the authors or the author were aware of this fact, that they were bringing up all these incredible parts in their plays?
Cleopatra.
And at the end, they would only be played by men.
Cleopatra
Which
says
to me
that.
is sort of a very, very strange contradiction. I mean,
Cleopatra complains that in the future someone will boy me on the stage.
You do
As
get
the
the
boy on
occasional
the stage
message.
says that.
Yes. I mean, one interesting thing is that there were female playwrights and actresses in Italy at the time. So someone who went to Italy would have seen that, and would have had that basis of reference, and maybe the hope that one day it would happen in England too. And perhaps drawn inspiration from that to create female characters with the idea that one day maybe they would be played by women.
I do wonder, though, the amount of cross-dressing heroines that he wrote, or she wrote, or they wrote, or whoever wrote, whether there wouldn't have been, just like, I know it's really cheesy, but just like in Shakespeare in Love, whether there wouldn't have been women who desperately wanted to be on the stage, who disguised themselves as boys, who then disguised themselves as women. I am sure that would have been happening, and I feel like when I read Shakespeare that he knows somebody who's doing that. That's just my feeling. I'm sure it would have been going on.
Don't you think also that I've no idea about this. I'm not a scholar, but the plays were very often done at court before they were made public. It's perfectly possible that the women in court wanted to be in them, and why wouldn't they? Because it was a private, and they were all absolutely able to deliver that stuff. They understood it completely. They could, so either him, whoever it's she might have been writing originally for knowing that these would have been grown-ups investing what they have into a wonderful script. And once it goes out public, of course, we know there are constraints that certainly the court, I'm assuming, did not have. Is that right? We don't know.
I don't know.
I read it somewhere.
Robin.
Isn't that why Blackfriars didn't?
you weren't allowed to build certain sort of theatre. Blackfriars was on technically church grounds, so it didn't count as public, it was private or something.
Oh, so they could have women.
I don't know. But there's grey areas, I think.
Robin, you wanted to chip in?
The author has told us many times, especially in the sonnets, that my work is going to last. My work is going to go down in history. My name will be forgotten, but my work will go down. So I don't think this author limited the work to just what was happening in that world at the time.
Yeah.
This author clearly saw these works going down through history.
As the Greeks had come down to.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely.
They were well aware of that lineage of how long things can last, especially in writing. Monuments may fall, but the writing, because it's reiterated in multiple copies, has a better chance of living through history.
Well, that seems like a really good point to end it on, because we are pretty much at 1:30. I want to say thank you to the panel. Give them a...